Welcome all to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology Monday night seminar. I'm John Fitzpatrick. I'm director of the lab and privileged to have you all here. We're especially privileged to have two eminent, highly trained artists in their own right who share the last name of the featured artist around you in the room here, Alan and Paul Singer. Here to talk tonight about an American master about whom they've just published a truly amazing book, beautifully put together and written and designed, and it's about a genuine American master. When we speak about the history of ornithology in America, we routinely talk about the great scientists who've made their contributions through technical literature. But we also often bring to mind great artists as well, people like George Mish Sutton, who did both, and so on. And when we here at the Lab of Ornithology talk about the history of ornithology, we also include those who've made enormous contributions with their eyes, their passions, and their unique talents to communicate nature to people. I consider Arthur Allen to be one of the greats. Arthur Allen, he was too, right? Arthur Singer to be one of the greats. And I want to know of the group here who's here tonight, how many of you went out and bought this book when it first came out? There's a lot of hands here, and I'm one of them. I was 13 at the time. I still have that original copy. In fact, my wife keeps her life list in it. And we cherish these beautiful originals. And when this book came out, the Chan Robbins Arthur Singer Guide, Zim never gets very much play in those authors' names, but this is often referred to as the Robbins and Singer Guide, and it was a revolutionary guide in its time. You may be talking about it tonight, so I won't steal thunder, but this guide stood side by side and every bit chin to chin with the Peterson Guide that had become so famous, partly because it was the first guide to put all the birds together of North America, but it also put the maps on the same page as the painting and so on. But it really was actually the guide that had, for the first time, birds in their lifelike poses with beautiful vignettes of habitats that communicated themselves in ways that no previous guide ever had. For ornithologists, or let's say for kids who were going to later become ornithologists, this is another great book in the history of American ornithology. The first really well done, artistically magnificent compendium of all of the bird families of the planet. And this, together with a little yellow miniature version or a abridged version, gave kids like me the chance to stay up late at night poring over the fact that, oh my goodness, the world is filled with lively, colorful things that I can't wait to go see. That was a consequence of the great genius of Arthur Singer. And so it's a huge privilege to welcome the two sons. I have to say the Singer apples must have been pretty heavy because they didn't fall too far from the tree. I'll introduce very briefly, concisely as I can, the two. Alan Singer, who's here nearby, had got his BA from Cooper Union and a master's degree here at Cornell in the Art and Architecture department in the mid-70s. He's a painter. He's had numerous solo exhibits of his own work all over the Northeast and in New York City. He's a printmaker. He's an author. He's a blogger. Is he a tweeter? And he's also an educator. He's now and has been since 1987 a professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology in the School of Art. Among Alan's distinctions is that he had a chance to work with his father, Arthur, in the 1982 production of the postage stamps that depicted all 50 of the state birds of the United States. And perhaps we'll hear a little bit about that tonight. The birds and flowers of the United States. Alan played a big role in the flower part, as well as the design, no doubt. Brother Paul, who will be the first of our two speakers here, also didn't fall far from the tree. BFA, pardon me, from the Philadelphia College of Art, and a master's from the Pratt Institute in Manhattan or Brooklyn. Pardon me, I shouldn't make that mistake, should I? Because Brooklyn is where you are today, yes. Paul. Since 1980, he's been has established the Paul Singer Design Studios, responsible for some great museum exhibitry, brochures, books, and the like. Exhibit graphics featuring natural history, cultural history, ethnography, and maritime history. Among the many works that Paul has contributed to were books relating to the Barcelona Olympics in 1992, right? So, once again, I'll take no more time. A great pleasure to introduce the two sons and two loving brothers of one another of Arthur Singer. We'll start with Paul Singer.
Thank you, John, and I want to thank the Cornell Lab for inviting us to give this talk tonight. This year will be the centennial of my father's birth. A few years ago, as I sat, not fully employed, a few contracts had ended. I was wondering where the next project might be. It occurred to me that something that I'd been thinking about for years was right in front of me, and that was my father's great career and the great art that he gave everyone. So within about a week or two, I had realized you better not wait for anybody else to do this book, because you may never see it in your lifetime. The responsibility is going to have to be your own. And when I accepted that reality, it became clear to me what I was going to do. Within about a week or two, I had outlined what I wanted to do in the book. And I was fortunate to have a great library of painted images that my father had had the foresight to have photographed in his life, of the paintings that mattered to him the most. He assumed that for one or another of his exhibits that he would need to be able to reproduce them in color. So he had them professionally photographed. And when I began the conceptualization and the writing of the book, I had pretty close to all of his important paintings already in reproducible form. In other words, I had high-resolution scans. I also had a treasure trove of family photos that went back to probably when he was a teenager, certainly by the time he was in Cooper Union. And so I realized that most of the images that I would need to do a book like this, we already had. I didn't have to track down, his collectors and ask permission to have them paintings photographed. And so I had pretty much the mother lode right in my hand. And being a graphic designer, I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to create the book that you would like to see you know, designed and printed and available to the public. You can do that. So for the next several months, and for about the half a year of 2015, that's what I proceeded to do. And 2015 just happened to be the 25th anniversary of my father's passing. And by the time our book was published, it was the centennial of his birth. So I'm going to take you now through how he became the artist that he became. And we're going to start right in the very beginning. And let's hope I do this right. 50 years of wildlife art. I would say, I didn't want to stretch that and say 60 years of wildlife art. But actually, he started his first wonderful drawings probably by the age of 12. Now, he grew up in Manhattan on Audubon Avenue. Hey, what a coincidence, you know. And drew everything that interested him as a child. And that was a lot of things. So barges, dirigibles, the George Washington Bridge, and anything that he saw that he was fascinated with, he drew. That was the way he saw it. He was an artist before he knew he was an artist. His family noticed the talent, and they noticed that some of the magazines that he would look at and maybe copy pictures out of happened to be the National Geographic, and he happened to be copying and very interested in animal pictures, the mammals, the birds, and so forth. So by about 1929, they began regular excursions to the Bronx Zoo. I have one of those drawings here. That's going to be the next one you're going to see. And he, like many young artists, my brother, myself, we filled up dozens and dozens of sketchbooks because that's what young artists really do. They get obsessed with drawing. And that's what my father got obsessed with. I have no idea how many drawings he really did, but he did a lot. I have about 90 wonderful drawings. He must have done hundreds and hundreds. So, he was noticed at the Bronx Zoo. And then of course he went up to the Museum of Natural History and saw the dioramas being painted in the late 1920s. Francis Lee Jaques and Perry Wilson. And he talked to them. Now, what we see here is what I think, from all the drawings I've gone through that I have, is his earliest bird drawing. And I think we can tell that because if you look closely at the lettering, it's the lettering of maybe somebody that's 11 or 12. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say he was probably 11 or 12, possibly even younger when he did this drawing. So he was already fascinated with birds and larger animals, but I'm not going to show you that tonight. I'm just going to show you the birds. This is done probably a few years later, maybe a year or two later. And you can see that there's an elegance of line already. I would assume he was somewhere around 13 when he did this. And he's into it, you can tell. I love the crowned crane on the right. It's just wonderful. I think these might have come a little later. Maybe he's 15 years old. I know for a fact that the cock of the rock and the casbill hornbill were shown later in 1942 in his first solo show at the Bronx Zoo. They offered him a show because they considered him like a rising and important young artist. These were in that show. He couldn't be there because he was in Europe at the time in World War II. Now we go to something that's possibly a little bit later. If he's maybe 15 or 16, it's the early 30s. He's done this wonderful ostrich. This is all the earlier drawings are all lead or they're colored pencils. The ostrich now is a wash, an ink wash, and color. And we have these wonderful pigeons and doves that you can see on the right. By the time he gets to 18 years old, he easily gets into Cooper Union. He was a star student there. He becomes interested and fascinated by what he's now being exposed to that he didn't know about before. And he gets quite taken with Neolithic art, which he saw in maybe the National Geographic and portfolios of prints from Lascaux and Altamira. And he bought those portfolios, and it influences the work from the time. So throughout Cooper Union, he wasn't doing realistic portrayals of animals anymore. He was doing highly stylized interpretations. Oh, here's a picture of young author before he went to Cooper. We figure he's about 16 years old here. This would be in his room in his home. And we can see some of his art books. He's already collecting a picture folder of from magazines. He cuts all the pictures of animals and birds out and saves them and mounts them book by book, all the cats, you know, and then he breaks it down into finer delineations, so the tigers are in one, the lions are in another. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. Much more decorative, highly stylized, fascinating to look at. He did many, many of these. They're really wonderful, but they're nothing like his later work. These became decorative in the way that he actually sold designs to a famous wallpaper company, Shoemaker. And however, it didn't quite jibe with the idea that he wanted to be a wildlife artist, because he'd already made up his mind. It was just, how do you do that in the Depression when, you know, nobody's interested in paying anything for that. So these are very interesting studies. And then, of course, he graduates Cooper. He's already met his wife-to-be. They marry. He goes into advertising. That's the way you would make money then. He hasn't stopped his love for wildlife at all. But he goes into the Army, and he goes into the Signal Corps, where, you know, all of the talented artistic people were directed to. And they designed camouflage and various visual and audio deception, and were highly successful. And the story, that's a whole other story. It's called The Ghost Army. The book is out. The documentary film is out. And he played his part in that, and he's featured in that book. And he was known in his group for the portraits he could paint of his buddies. Here is a picture. Why is that up there? Here's a picture of a snowy landscape that he composed. He saw one morning. He knew he wanted to paint it. It took 6 sheets of watercolor paper. He taped them together. Somebody offered a warm place for him to stay, and he spent the day painting this. And it's one of his early masterpieces. Yeah, wonderful. A beautiful piece, just sublime. Anyhow, after the war, he had a show of his watercolors in 1946 from the war. These are a couple of the portraits of some of his buddies. We have no idea of how many he did, because he tended to give them away if he was asked. Alan and I share about 12 of them. He might have done 20 or 30 or more. but nobody could paint a watercolor portrait like he could. So after the war, he goes into advertising, and he keeps himself open to any possibility to do nature illustration. And by the early 50s, he starts getting opportunities to do that. Field and Stream, Argosy, the sporting magazines, the hunting magazines is where he got early work. And then one of his friends, who was an art director at Sports Illustrated, commissioned him to do A Tree of Birds that was written by Robert Cushman Murphy, a very famous ornithologist of the time. So I'm going to show you a few of these pictures. He did other projects at that time. World Book Encyclopedia was one of them. And they led to a very important project with the American Home magazine, which I'm going to show you some pictures of. So this is the Sports Illustrated cover, very decorative, kind of reminiscent of what he did in the 1940s. And this is what he did afterwards. He was influenced by Jacques Baraband and the Le Vaillant prints. They're famous for Parrots of the World and other books that were done in the late 18th and early 19th century. And this is a painting that he did around 1952, about 1952. About 1954, he did another major painting, The Brown Pelicans, and this is in gouache. And it was at RIT, and the exhibit at RIT, a magnificent piece. Arthur met a close friend, later became a close friend, Don Eckelberry, very famous bird artist, ornithologist, through his wife Virginia, who worked at the same advertising agency as Arthur did in the 1950s. And they became friends. And as kids, we often went out there to visit when we were 12 years old, about 12, 13 years old. Or I was 13 years old, Alan was a little younger. So he gets contacted by the American Home magazine. They want to do a series of bird and flower prints, decorative for homes. They first published them in the magazine, and the magazines sold out, just completely unexpectedly sold out, so that they started selling portfolios of 8 prints because they couldn't keep up with the demand. Over the years, they sold something like 14 million portfolios of 8 prints. So out there's about 100 million prints. I don't know how many survive, but you'll see tons of them on eBay any day of the week. Just go Arthur Singer Birds and you'll see them. And he became more well-known. He was contacted by the Reader's Digest. I think he might have done maybe 6 covers for the Reader's Digest, and numerous other magazines, which led to, and here's one of these magnificent American Home prints, the goldfinches, just wonderful. And here are 3 more. There was 8 altogether. They're out there, people own them. And they led to a commission to do a stamp, a cut and paste stamp book of birds, which led eventually to Birds of the World. And although it started with Robert Porter Allen being the writer, Golden Press hired Oliver Austin, and under the direction of Herbert Zem, assembled a team. Arthur started this project about 1957, and the staff at the Museum of Natural History were his consultants. So Dean Amadon, Roger Cushman Murphy, Robert Cushman Murphy, John Bull, Charles O'Brien, Tom Gilliard were some of the people that he consulted with there, and everything had to be scientifically accurate, so it was. The book was very successful, sold, was eventually translated into 8 languages and sold several 100,000 copies, and you can still buy it today, although you're buying it through eBay or a second-hand seller. To reward himself, he took his first big trip to Africa for 3 weeks, carrying his gigantic long lens, which weighed a ton. But he managed to, photograph hundreds, if not thousands of photographs, came back with material that he painted as late as the 1980s. I'm going to show you a painting later called Flamingo Ballet. We don't own it anymore, but it's in a collection. And it was based on the sightings he made at Lake Magadi. And here's a picture of him from a television program that he was invited to be on, explaining the process of doing Birds of the World. This would have been maybe 1961, 62, something like that. Right? On the Today Show. The Today Show in 1961 or whatever. And here's the cover of Birds of the World, which we didn't see before, and of course he designed the cover, designed the layout, designed the typography, because Arthur was an all-around artist. I mean, there was no detail that he didn't want to be part of. So let's see. This is not moving to the next slide, but we want it to. So these things are inevitable, It has to happen, but it's insignificant.
Just got to get rid of that little box thing.
There we go. So I'm going to show you a couple of the plates from this. You have probably already seen 1 or 2 of them because they're behind us. But this is antbirds and antshrikes and pittas. And what is that popping up? Am I touching something?
Yeah.
Oh, am I touching something on the bottom? I didn't.
If you just touch the pad again, it should go.
You mean here?
Yeah,
Just of this? Oh,
just kinda
okay. I must have put my finger on that. And here we have another beautiful painting, which is actually part of the cover of our book. I couldn't resist. It just was so right for the cover. And here's another plate that we still retain, we still own, thank God. The Quetzals and the Kingfishers. And, the book, as I said, sold in Japan. It's sold all over Europe. It is considered a classic today. And it led to a string of other successful books, the next of which is Birds of North America. And this was, Golden had the idea, and maybe it was Herbert Zimmer who had the idea, to take on, Roger Tory Peterson's guide. They thought it was a little old-fashioned. It was a little stiff. It didn't show you enough clues about how a bird perches. It didn't show you the kind of habitat that that the bird lived in, and the text was like 50 pages in the back. The text did not match side by side with the illustration. So the Golden Guide came along, and it was the #1 guide at the time. And it led to, of course, many other, contemporary guides that have taken something from it. Yes, and yes. So yes, it sold millions of copies. Here are a couple of plates from it. Unfortunately, most of them are lost now. And when the company went bankrupt. And this led to, many other books, of which I won't talk about zoo animals because I'm only talking about birds today. And cats, because I am only talking about birds today. But it led to Birds of Europe, which was started about 1967 or 68, something like that. They published a larger format book and a smaller guidebook. And here's a picture of Arthur invited to Windsor Castle, I guess. And he's giving a copy of the book to Prince Philip. And he gave an original, from the book, an oil painting of the goshawk for the collection of Prince Philip. He and the author, Bertel Brun, later, I think it was around this time, traveled around Europe to a number of countries. They also had a couple of audiences with the King of Norway and the King of Sweden, but they did a lot of birding down in the Côte d'Ignana, the Camargue. They went to Israel, they went to Turkey, they were in Greece, and basically they got a good amount of European birding in. It was in this Birds of Europe that my father really got a little bit out of the usual painting of identification plates and into composing paintings, and he did some magnificent paintings. I think there were about 27 paintings in the book, of which better than half of them are oil paintings, and some of them are, quite amazing. We don't have too many of those anymore. The creative team at Golden broke up in the late 1960s, about 1971. There were some legal issues, and so the team went over and founded Vineyard Press. Here's a painting from the Birds of Europe, one of the first snowy owl paintings Arthur did. This was in his first really big show at the Hammer Gallery, and this sold there. And we have a painting of loons on the left and eider ducks on the right. And the loons, there's a little bit of that Bruno Lilliefors, a painter that he really admired. I guess a Swedish, was he Swedish or Norwegian? Maybe Swedish. And here's another painting from the book of the common puffin. And this also sold at that show. Terrific painting. This was followed in the early 70s, maybe it was published in 1973, The Life of the Hummingbird. Arthur went to meet the author, Alexander Scutch, I think it was in Costa Rica, and they spent a couple of weeks together. And Scutch wrote, is maybe one of the most famous ornithologists of the 20th century. I think he wrote somewhere upwards of 45 to 50 books. Obviously this is one of them, but he wrote many books on Central American and South American birds, and on botany, and on philosophy, and he lived to the age of 100. He passed away in, I think, the year 2000. So they had a great time together, and here's Arthur in maybe 1971 and Alexander Scutch, and they hit it off, I'm sure they were birds of the feather, They appreciated the same things, what's important in life. This one, I think we have this in the back, the streamer-tailed hummingbird. But these are several of the plates from the book. I think he illustrated maybe around 90 species in the book. I have to admit, I have no idea how many species of hummingbirds there are in Central and South and North America, but probably more than that. In the mid-70s, oops, I did it again. Whoa. Whoa. Oh, there it is. Very good. In the mid-'70s, two of the books that he had completed and due to be published remained unpublished, and to this day unpublished. The president of the company and died suddenly. The company failed, and Birds of the Ocean never got published, and Birds of Seven Continents never got published. I recently, about a year or two ago, visited Birds of the Ocean at the Museum of Natural History in the ornithology department, and they showed me the plates, and I was just stunned because I had never seen them being painted, and they were magnificent. But you know, it's publishing, and after that, another book came out in English, pelagic birds of. I think Birds of the, I forget the title, but it's on pelagic birds. And it was too late. It couldn't, there was no way they could resuscitate the book, and it just went away. And, you know, in the last year of my father's life, he decided to give the entire work to the Museum of Natural History for all the assistance they had provided him over 40 or more years. So they own it now, although they're willing to publish it, and I have often thought it's possible to get it published. It might be very difficult. Anyhow, the other book was Birds of the Seven Continents, and we're going to see one of those plates now. Oh, that's Birds of the Ocean. That's 3 pages of Birds of the Ocean. We have eiders, we have shearwaters, we have terns. And here's one of the pages from Birds of the Seven Continents. I guess this is on the eagles. Harpy eagle over on the right hand, and the secretary bird and an osprey, and here's some blackbirds and yellow-headed blackbirds and meadowlarks and red-shouldered blackbirds and grackles. And there's another plate, of which there were something like between 110 and 120 plates. I figured that this possibly was a smaller version of Birds of the World. It goes family by family. Quite an interesting bunch of plates, and some of them are amazingly spectacular. So I would love to do this book too, but I don't know if we can do that. Here's a day in Ithaca, shared by my father on the right with that goofy smile, and Roger Torrey Peterson in the center talking to Don Ecclebury, who was a real character. Don is a person that you only meet once in your life. He was like truly amazing. He could tell stories for a day, and he would probably have hardly scratched the surface, and good stories too. Peterson I didn't know very well, but my brother and I spent many days and many evenings at Don Ecclebury's house, so he was quite a great character and quite a great artist also. Conservation magazines, well, by the early 1960s, they were contacting Arthur to do covers and to do articles, illustrate articles. Natural History magazine, which is, I guess, the house organ of the Museum of Natural History, Audubon magazine, National Geographic, he did several projects for, Defenders of Wildlife, he did some prints for, and in the mid-'80s, Audubon awarded him the Hal Borland Award for his contributions to the appreciation and understanding of nature and science. This, I think, dates from around 1972-73, and this is various pelagic birds, from albatrosses, shearwaters, petrels, icebirds, on and on. This is a migration map for the National Geographic that you can see occasionally sold on eBay. It's quite a spectacular illustration. And here's a page from, he did 10 or 11 paintings for Audubon magazine on the Asa Wright Nature Center. And they're wonderful paintings, some of them in gouache, some of them in oil. This one is owned by Lee Yorkie Woodson Art Museum, and is one of the illustrations that he did for this article, which I think was around 1987. Limited editions, of course, everybody got into the print business then. Even Don Eccleberry did some prints. Anne Ophelia Dowden, botanical artist. Charlie Harper, who does these very interesting, slightly cartoonish, stylized images. Richard Evans Younger, Charles Frasset, Ray Harm. I don't love their work, but they were serious artists. And his friend Guy Koliak, who also did limited editions with his own company, Regency House, and Robert Bateman, who I guess was one of the most successful of all of them, and is still going strong. After his ties with Vineyard ended because of the sudden death and bankruptcy, he had fewer book commissions. There were several state birds that he did with Allen, and he did The Birds of Greenland, and he did a children's book, an ABC book of pastels. There were birds and animals, and birds and mammals, and reptiles. They were all animals, yes. And at this point, yes, and at this point, by the early 1980s, Allen was already assisting Arthur. Arthur had some vision problems at this point, and he couldn't handle the demands. The workload was enormous. And of course, the next thing was, after these limited edition prints, of which I'm showing you two, a red-tailed hawk and these belted kingfishers, which are both phenomenal. He did 21 of these paintings for Frame House. But after that, it was the state bird and flower stamps. And so this commission, first by the government, and even before that, a private company that had wanted them to do first day covers. They completed a set of 50 first day covers and the 50 bird and flower stamps, state bird and flower stamps, which became at the time, I would say, the biggest commemorative seller that the post office had ever had at that time. Like 500 million sheets were sold, which I guess translates into what, 20 billion stamps or something? Something like that. 25 billion? 500? Yeah, 25 billion stamps. Anyhow, one of the last projects they did together was State Birds in 1986. And when the Smithsonian hosted an exhibit of all the original art for the bird and flower stamps, and they also showed some plates from the State Birds books, they attracted 250,000 visitors in the months that the exhibit was up. So that was pretty significant. And here's a picture of Alan, a few years younger, and my dad over on the left of the three, by this large reproduction of the 50 bird and flower stamps. At the end of these contracts, and from about the late 70s on, he was painting more. He had a little more time to give to it. He had fewer demanding commissions, although the State Birds was a big commission. So he could paint more. And I know I encouraged him to do more easel painting, and so did my brother. And so he proceeded to do that. And we figured that he painted somewhere on the order of about 150 oils in the last 12 or 13 years of his life, give or take. He had the big show at the Hammer Gallery. He had another show at the Hammer Gallery, I think, in 1984. And I'm going to show you a few samples of those paintings. And of course, all along, when he got out into the field, and he wasn't bird watching, and he wasn't photographing, he was doing landscape watercolors, and he was extremely good at it. we tried to keep up, but my father was very good at it. So I'm going to show you a few of the paintings. There's a few of the paintings here. So this was another version of the pheasants that he did. This is a fairly large painting, oil painting, at Muttontown Preserve. And this has recently traded hands, or changed hands. I know the owner of this. Fabulous painting. And here's a great gray owl that we had sold out of the estate, and it came up for auction not too long ago. I thought I had owned it. I thought I had the right bid, but I was wrong. I thought it was going to be in my possession, but it's in another important collector's possession. I won't mention the name. Here's a little gouache of a sparrowhawk that he probably painted in an hour or two. It's very fresh. It's never been framed. It's never been shown except now. But we will frame it, and it may be in one of the next exhibits. Here we can see the bald eagle at Glacier Bay. It's over on the wall on the left. Magnificent painting. We figure he painted somewhere between 8 and 9, 8 and 10, maybe, oil paintings of bald eagles in different postures, because some of his favorite subjects he painted again and again, like great blue herons, bald eagles, and others. Skimmers, brown pelicans. So here's another snowy owl, and snowy owls, of course, snowy owl. How could I forget that? This is an interesting painting. He probably did it in, I'm going to guess, I didn't watch him do it, but I'm going to guess that he painted it in maybe 2 hours or 3 hours at the most. It's all palette knife. And here's a painting of marbled godwits and a Heerman's gull. And here's a Toko toucan, which is owned by the Lee Yorkie Woodson Art Museum. One of the three significant oils that they own by author. And here's, I guess, collared arsary, magnificent gouache, just a fantastic piece that got snapped up at one of his exhibits. And this is the flamingos that he originally saw at Lake Magadi, and he finally painted, I think, around 1983 or 1984, which is roughly 23 or 24 years after he had first seen it and photographed it. He got around to making this painting. These can all be seen in our book, these and many more, and this one as well. And this is a group of egrets, reddish egret, Louisiana heron, great egret. I could be wrong about that, but and it's the way he composed. You know, he did. This is not photographic. As you can tell, he doesn't do photographic paintings. This is an assembled, this is a designed painting. He knew what he wanted to do. He knew the mangroves he wanted to paint. He knew the birds he wanted to include in it. He composed it beautifully, but there was never quite this assemblage that he actually saw. This might be different parts of several photographs. This is Siberian cranes, a large watercolor that we have. And I think that may conclude, do I have any more images? Oh yes, the roseate spoonbill. So I'm taking you through probably the later paintings that he did, but it gives you like a bit of an insight into his creative mind, into his passion for birds, his passion for wildlife, complete dedication. The man worked from 9 in the morning to 9 in the evening, but never considered it work. It was his pleasure to do it. And that is the conclusion of our.
I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. It's been a pleasure listening to my brother, who did so much work putting this book together. And we collaborated on that as we've done in the past on other projects. But I also want to thank the lab for inviting us in the first place to have this show. And it's a wonderful opportunity. My father would have been so pleased to have his paintings hanging in the same room with Luis Agassiz Fuertes. So, you know, thank the lab for offering us this opportunity. I hope to answer some questions after my short speech here, if you can call it a speech, but you may have some questions about how Arthur actually did what he did. And that's my little talk tonight, bringing art and ornithology together. You know, one thing I would say is that my father had great patience. He also, from the examples that my brother have shown you, great hand skills. Now, some of that probably comes from the family that he grew up in. My grandma, my father's mom, made very fine doll's clothes for F.A.O. Schwartz for most of her life. And so I think my father may have learned something about patience just from watching his mom create these beautiful little things that were sold. So there was something about that that comes through, even in this work here that we're seeing of the ostrich. And I look at that ostrich and I say, he loved the materials that he was using. There's a couple of drops of ink that have spread out on a moist piece of paper, then augmented with a few lines of color and a little indication of detail. My father understood the detail. And I think he understood that literally from the time that he was a little kid. And the example that we happen to have up here on the screen comes from Birds of the World, which already, you know, was many years into his career. But it was fascinating to watch him work and literally paint every feather. So he had great patience, and he was also able, with his art, to describe things that are hard to understand, like, in this case, the ostrich's foot, which is able to stand the weight of the bird, which sometimes can weigh up to 300 pounds or more. My father worked from direct observation. Here we have a picture of him. Some neighbor had brought to him a little baby bird. The little baby bird's in the ashtray, sitting there on the desktop while my father paints its portrait. My father's about 45 in this photograph. We had just moved to Long Island. He set up his studio at home. He worked at home. So for a family growing up, my father was always working, but we had the opportunity to learn a lot from watching him work. And when my father wasn't painting directly from life, he was using the study skins that he would borrow from the Museum of Natural History in New York City. And I often went with him to watch him carefully pick out these bird skins to work with at home, and he would select the birds that he wanted based on their plumage and the qualities that they showed. And I was very often impressed because he'd take them home in little shoe boxes, and I'd look at the tags. Very often these birds were mounted by John James Audubon himself and were signed. The tags were signed by Audubon. So an artist, of course, must do, if you're going to paint birds and animals, you must do field work. And my father spent a good portion of every year that I was aware of out in the field, either painting directly from life or with his long lens that my brother talked about, which you see here, doing field work, which was essentially finding the birds and photographing them. And it was all-consuming when he was out there. That's what he was looking for. As I said, his studio was home, and this is a typical scene of my father working on perhaps pages from a bird guide. And you know, he's got his watercolors out. He was a smoker, you know, which probably ended up, you know, impacting his health later on. Smoking a pipe and listening probably to jazz music. He was absolutely in love with jazz. And here he is sitting in the backyard, our backyard in Jericho, Long Island, with his book in the first edition. And I think enjoying just sunlight and just the fact that birds would come to him. Now, since he was at home, the studio always seemed to have a project going on, and he was always working on illustrations for books or magazines. And he hadn't really spent that much time doing the paintings, many of the larger paintings that we see here in our show, because he was under contract. First to Golden Books to produce a sticker book, and then Birds of the World, and then Birds of North America, and then Birds of Europe. So these projects went on for years at a time. They usually start with drawing. I could say that, you know, after the field work, after you get your bird skins to study, after you've taken the photographs, the first thing that you're going to do is probably sit and draw. And most artists do that type of work. Solitary, it's time consuming, but that way you can work out what you're going to be painting. And here you see literally a view that I photographed him over his shoulder as he's drawing a whole little composition of pelicans. First, it works on paper. If you're going to paint, draw it out. The drawings that he made were often in pastel on tracing paper, and he would do numbers of them before he would solidify a composition that he was sold on. So when having worked with him, I understand that this was his process, and I think all artists have a process of some sort that they call their own. So I think that when I look at my father's work now, also in retrospect, I realize that he's a consummate designer. Nothing seems out of place in my father's work. Everything seems to have a balance and an internal reason for being. Partly that's because he made many, many preparatory sketches, and we see this in this case as a very big painting that he was doing for a commercial company. I think it was a real estate company. And so it was a commission, and so he would do a number of sketches, probably deciding on the one that he liked the most to show to the client. And then he would render his subject. Often in watercolor, often in gouache. A little later on in his career, he spent more time with oil paint and acrylic. These paintings took time to develop. Here is a look right over his shoulder again on a composition with a kingfisher. You can notice that he's working with a little tiny brush. He's got a very, very fine brush for this big composition. This took him quite a bit of time, but it was normal for my father. This is part of his working day. Rough sketch for Birds of North America for the book cover. When a project like this came up, he would often do numbers of sketches also for the covers and give the publisher a choice. This is the one that ended up being used in a different version for the cover of his book. And in 1977, 1978, they determined that they were going to revise his bird guide, and I worked with him on that revision. Having watched him work for so many years, I was able to mimic his style. So when he started to develop eye problems, I did some of the work on the birds, on the backgrounds, and helped him because his workload was very heavy. That's a picture of me and him around the time that we got started working on the birds and flowers of the 50 states. And so we'd say this is about 1981. There's a painting of roseate spoonbills going on in the background. He's working on a bittern. There's a painting of a trogon in the background by Don R. Eckleberry, a close friend. And he's working at home. This is the way our commission started out, literally with one of the first drawings. We would have a little, you'd say, discussion about who's going to do what. Of course, I decided that I was better with flowers and he was better with the birds, so that's the way it went. Arthur did all of the birds for our postage stamps, and I did all of the flowers. And we designed the work together, and every week, for at least 2 days a week, I visited with him and I would do my part. So there's a composition which in the end had to be redrawn, because once it came down to postage stamp size, it was deemed too detailed for their particular need. So it was redesigned and redone. So sometimes the compositions worked first time, and sometimes they had to be redrawn. I don't know whether you can see it, but it's a pastel sketch that my father made for a subsequent book that we illustrated together called The State Birds. And this was endorsed by the National Audubon Society and the National Wildlife Federation. I really enjoyed this project. But I have to say that my father was already experiencing eye problems. He had glaucoma, and then he had cataracts that developed. And I did a lot of work on this project. But once again, we divided the work up. My father did the birds, and I did the flowers and the landscapes in the State Birds book. That was our final project together. It was 1986 that this book was published. Now, my father did spend some time talking to the media, and he did that to further his career and also advertise the projects that he worked with. And I just wanted to end my discussion here about the art that he did with a little short video, which we're going to cue up. So let's get that on, and you can see. Take care of that. You can see it is it's a presentation that was originally aired in 1982, Sunday morning with Charles Kuralt. So let's see it.
I walked into a post office the other day to buy a sheet of stamps, expecting 50 American eagles or 50 American flags, the sort of thing you get when you buy a sheet of stamps. But what I was handed was 50 joyous little masterpieces, drummed miniatures of all the state birds and flowers, so bright and appealing that I hated to see them marred by anything so ordinary as a postmark. It turns out that they are the work of a father and son, Arthur Singer, noted painter of birds, and his son Alan, who knows his flowers.
This is the Hammer Gallery in New York City.
Arthur Singer in New York supervising an installation of all his major paintings with the encouragement of his sons. Oh, yeah, I like that. I'm looking forward to it. No way. of course. But the conversation kept coming back to those little stamps.
You don't have the whole 50. You're missing a row.
Well, I know because I used a couple today.
Well, you can't really sign it.
Well, you can sign on top of some of these because they're duplicated.
No, they're not duplicated.
What?
There is no,
Well,
there's
the
no two
pictures
that
are not duplicated, but the words are duplicated.
Each of the 50 stamps is a precise double portrait. Altogether, the states united. The first day ceremony for the stamps was held in Washington with a fanfare for the singers and their stamps. 2 singers, 426 million stamps. No artists have ever had such bestsellers.
Kind of excited me. It was a very wonderful job to do. I enjoyed it, every bit of it. It's kind of like a puzzle, you know, because in the case of, for instance, the cardinal, where 7 states have a cardinal, you wonder whether you can come up with 7 different enough compositions so that each stamp will look totally different.
Singer, designer of the birds on the stamps, and his talented son, Alan, who designed the flowers. As far as we know, they are the first father and son team to design a stamp issue for the United States Postal Service.
I think making stamps is making a poster, like making a poster in miniature, so that each element sort of stood out, and you can see everything very clearly, but yet it still looked very natural, and that's a hard thing to do. I visit the botanical gardens close to my home in Brooklyn very frequently, almost on a weekly basis, to stroll through for pleasure, or in the case of jobs that I have to illustrate textbooks and other kinds of articles. I go there regularly and investigate material in the library. So I'm familiar with printed material and the actual flowers from studying them and making drawings of them right there in the botanical gardens.
It's nice to work from life. With a plan, it's easy because they're not going to fly away on you. However, just about every subject in this 50 was photographed in life by me, and frequently in the place they live. Like I've been to Alaska, so I was able to photograph ptarmigan up there. And this is aside from the enormous collection of books I have, and also a very huge picture collection, which must number into the nearly 6 figures. The difficulty in this 50 was 1 or 2 birds, well, particularly Delaware, the blue hen chicken. Is no one knows anything about it. It's living in the state. An old, very primitive-looking engraving, and this blue hen chicken must have been brought by the pilgrims to amuse themselves. It was a fighting cock. They bet on fights, cockfights. But it seems to me that when every other state is actually a wild bird, except Rhode Island. Rhode Island has a Rhode Island red. These two are kind of off. You know, I would love to someday make up my own list of 50 state birds. I wouldn't have a repeat on it. It could be much more interesting to have 50 different birds. For example, there is not outside of the Nene Goose, there are no ducks. And look at how popular ducks are. There's not a Bob White. Bob White is really a bird that most Americans know and love, although you don't often see it because they're quite secretive. Quail can be quite secretive. I would have a Bob white, there isn't a single owl or a single bird of prey. And I think that's an oversight. But then generally people like little pretty backyard birds, but there are an awful lot of birds overlooked that could be very beautiful. There's not an egret, there's not a heron in the thing, there's not a kingfisher. Kingfisher is a wonderful bird. There's not an eagle, there isn't even a wild turkey. Now, Franklin picked that as his choice for the nation's bird, and yet it doesn't appear in the stamps anywhere. So I think there's too great an abundance of cardinals in Montana and western Norfolk, and not enough variation.
You have one where you're looking the European goldfinch and the American goldfinch in the same picture.
Yes, that's what birds of the world.
Yes, but where did you find them together?
You won't find them together, but in birds of the world, I had to show species from everywhere, 5 different continents.
All right, okay.
So those are not realistic conceptions.
What is the
species conception?
Does the European goldfinch live in Bermuda? I understand. One of the
There may be some.
naturalized there.
Ask Roger Peterson.
Many aristocrats and bird watching were there when the show of Arthur Singer's Jing paintings opened in Midtown Manhattan. The show brought together the artist and his friends and a lifetime of intense observation and painstaking work. The life's work that prepared him to paint those 50 bright miniatures I was handed one day at the post office.
That's great snow effect. The eye of the head of the eagle is just wonderful. Magnificent.
I think it's time to close that out. So, I don't know, escape. Oh, Mark? This is, I think they run a commercial during this period of time. I think that's it. Yeah. Just want to close it out. Right. And actually, at this particular period of time, if there's any questions, this would be a good time if there's anybody who wants to ask about something. Yes, you've got your hand.
So I have a question about the gouache. How do you do cast gouache, right?
Gouache.
How that's done.
Would you mind coming back?
Oh, sure.
And also, if you can remember to repeat the questions, that'd be great.
People wanted to know about gouache. Gouache being a water-based tempera paint that has a binder that's that makes it look a little chalky, but actually is one of my father's preferred media. And the reason why he chose that is because it reproduces very beautifully. It's a water-based media, but you can re-wet it and move it around. He often used these little tiny brushes. They're called zeros or sometimes triple zeros to make very fine marks on. Often these paintings are done on illustration board. Some of them are done on paper with gouache. But it's just one of his media that he liked to work with. He also liked watercolor, and he liked, later in his career, I mentioned acrylic paint and oil paint. Those were his favorite media. Yes?
In the last decade or so of his life, he was doing the large format paintings. Did he have an agenda for the production of those? Was he doing this for pleasure, for sale, for commission, or just to?
Some of the paintings that he did were for a commission. Many of them were self-directed, and I think the paintings would last as long as they had to, in terms of the process of making them. So, it's on his own time, on his own schedule. Yes. I don't know. Yes?
Some of the pictures, especially I'm thinking of the flamingo,
Well, I would say the most stylistic artwork that my father got involved in, I think my brother mentioned the fact that my father was very influenced while he was in college by the cave painters of Altamira and Lascaux. And his artwork became much more stylized during the 1940s, 1930s. But I think with the commissions that he received, like from American Home, and we've got 4 of those hanging up in the back here, he came around to a different understanding of what the audience would like, maybe based on the popular process of doing the artwork and seeing that they sold. And sold many millions, and that's a style that really harkens back to Audubon, but is brought up to date with my father's sense of design. I don't know. Do you want to say something about that?
No, I was just going to say Audubon was a strong influence from the time he first discovered it, and he discovered Fuertes long before he knew about Audubon. So Audubon was only in the Cooper years when he was a student, maybe when he was 20. Cooper Union happened to own the Audubon folios. So he was shown the original folios. There's a long caption in the book, how blown away he was, because he had not seen that before. Now we see it all the time, but he had not seen that before, and he was completely blown away. I think the American Home prints were pretty strongly influenced by that idea, but he couldn't copy it, and he wouldn't copy the style. He was just influenced by it.
Right, and I would just have to say that my father was part of the Birds and Art shows that were organized by the Lee Yawkey Woodson Art Museum every year. My father was very aware of the other artists in the country that were creating art from nature, and birds in particular. And so he was very aware of it, but was he influenced by it, or did it change him? If there were any changes, they were very, very gradual. But I think my father's sense of design really is what drove him, and his, as I said, great patience and love for the subject. Yes?
I had a chance to get to know Peterson a bit and talk to him a few times about his work. And one of the things that rang out to me was that he described the years in which he was painting the field guides as being like in a prison. That he was chained to the board day after day to get the next painting out, to keep the schedule going. And there's a lot of paintings in these books. Did you ever have get a sense from your father that the books that were the Golden Guide and the European Guide,
So,
was some prisonness to that?
So if the question is, did my father regard his commission as being in prison?
No.
I would say there is a little bit of that, but mostly no, because I think that he realized that these projects would make his reputation. They would guarantee him stability. He was a family man, obviously, and I know he was under contract. So once you sign your name to that, you're in it for the duration. So I think he looked forward to his projects, and it was really only when publishing projects seemed to ebb away that he decided to spend more time on his paintings. Did he ever feel like he was imprisoned by it? Maybe on occasion, but because I think setting up the compositions for each page, it's restrictive, and you have to be able to communicate something with scientific accuracy that will also attract the public. So there's a balance that you have to achieve. I think more than that, I wouldn't hazard a guess. Maybe Paul has an idea about that.
I think that, he had such a dedication to the subject and to what he was doing that he couldn't, there was restrictions, obviously. You have to put 20 species on a plate or whatever. you know, the demands being. It was difficult in that respect, but he enjoyed, you know, he enjoyed the entire process, and you can see that in the way he can bring any of the birds, any groups of, you know, sparrows to life. All of a sudden, they look exciting, you know. So there's a certain kind of joy and a certain kind of passion that goes through all of his work, and there was hardly a time I think he was ever bored with. I mean, he wasn't that kind of person. He put his heart into everything, basically.
Maybe time for one more, and then if anybody.
Yeah, well, our last question of the. Well.
Being involved in the arts in New York City all that time, what was your home life like? And is involved love of jazz? Did other people visit? And
Oh, our home life was, I would say we were a very together family. And matter of fact, my father brought us out into the field to watch birds with him, my mom along with us, you know. My father took us as a family also to visit art galleries, art museums, wherever we traveled. So not only was he out in the field, but he would want to go see what's in the museum, what's showing at the gallery, and he was very balanced in that regard. So I would say it was a normal family life. It wasn't out of the ordinary for me.
I want to thank you,
Thank
Alan,
you.
and thank you, Paul, for
thank you.
A great presentation tonight, and for being here with us.
And if anybody wants us to sign a book, where
there
we
are
have books for sale.
There are books for sale out there.
Thank you very much, everybody.
And thank you.